Good morning. When I woke up this morning, I decided it was time to move from worrying about this event for the last 12 months. This was originally scheduled for May of this year and had to be postponed. So as of now, I'm looking forward to this event and looking forward to the extraordinary group of speakers that we have gathered together to share with you today, beginning with Chris Hedges. And if you don't know Chris Hedges, it's time that you discovered him. Chris Hedges has been a North Star for me as a fellow clergy person, not only because he also grew up in the mainline Protestant church at the peak of its social justice history, but also because he has been fearless in holding that institution accountable as a person of faith, which is a responsibility for all of us of people of faith to hold our religious institutions accountable for what they are doing within our communities. So Chris has very graciously agreed to offer an update on his 2006 book, American Fascists, The Christian Right and the War on America. This is pre-recorded from yesterday. And so without any other delays, let's turn to Chris.
Was a student at Harvard Divinity School in the early 1980s. My great mentor, James Luther Adams, who was then 80 years old, told us that when we were all his age, we would be fighting the Christian fascists. This was not, he did not use the term fascist lightly. He had been in Germany in 1935 and 1936, where he was bilingual in German, where he had studied at the University of Heidelberg. Indeed, he was attended lectures by Heidegger, where he began his lectures with a Nazi salute. He saw how the Nazi Party, in particular through the German Christian Church, fused the symbols and iconography of the Christian religion with the state, and in particular with the party. He understood what happened when huge numbers of the working class had the social bonds that connected them to the wider society ruptured and were left in despair, bereft of hope. And he saw that same process beginning in the United States. I was overseas for 2 decades. I left the country in 1983 and did not come back until the middle 1990s. I worked as a foreign correspondent, mostly for the New York Times, Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, the Balkans. And when I returned, because of that huge gap of time, I was stunned at how the Christian right had moved from the fringes of society into positions of significant power. They had built institutions in the way the left had not: Liberty University, Patrick Henry Law School, powerful media platforms that had hermetically sealed tens of millions of their own followers in this heretical form of Christianity. And I think one of the great failings of the liberal church, which I come out of, is its inability to denounce these Christian heretics for who they are. They have deformed the gospel, perverted the gospel to sacralize the worst elements of American imperialism and American capitalism. They are imbued with deep white supremacy, as if the white race, and in particular the American white race, stands at the vanguard of this supposedly Christian movement, will build a Christian state. It had upended its own ideological belief system, certainly preceding the 1980s. Evangelicals and fundamentalists had seen politics as a contaminant and called on believers to remove themselves from it. This changed with, in particular under Rousas Rushdoony, but other ideologues who called for the building of the Christian state, the Christian society, as a harbinger for the return of the second coming. And they had embraced all of the worst tenets of free market capitalism. And that was an interesting period that a lot of people who didn't look closely at the movement missed, because it used to be within the old Southern Baptist Church, and they took over Southern Baptist, one of the great seminaries of the country, one of the best seminaries in the country, around 1980. I can't remember the exact date. This was Al Mohler and others. But you had within the Baptist Church, very much like my father, who was a Presbyterian minister, very conservative personal piety, but very liberal kind of social piety. So that meant support for unions. Abortion, of course, was never really an issue. It meant support for all sorts of social service programs. And as the Southern Baptist Church was purged, those who may have clung to these old kind of conservative personal piety issues about drinking and even a kind of homophobia and everything else were pushed out. And that was a clear indication of how I think this was a political movement. So I set out to write a book called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War on America. It took me 2 years. I spent significant amounts of time in mega churches, and it's the only way to really understand the movement is to get inside it, as people who have broken with the movement and walked away, like Mel White and others have done. It was very revelatory for somebody who came out of the liberal church. I mean, for instance, in the mega churches, almost invariably run by white, male, narcissistic pastors who preyed on the despair of their congregations. You saw, as Hannah Arendt, when she talks about totalitarian systems, there's always that system of propaganda. That would be the service itself, the music, the kind of warm embrace, and then indoctrination, where you are then kind of lured into the church, the mega church, and all of your educational time and recreational time and everything becomes dominated. You're assigned disciplers. You can't question the leader of the church, again, almost always white male, because they are in direct contact with God. Any kind of questioning of the system or the ideology becomes backsliding. You're severed from your family. I mean, I was in prayer groups where people would be weeping because their spouses were not saved. I saw that the movement is the great destroyer of families. It bills itself as the supporter of family, but only if that family essentially surrenders to this ideology. And the whole prosperity gospel itself is heretical. The idea that Jesus came to make us rich. You don't have to spend, as I did, 3 years at Harvard Divinity School to realize that that is an utter fallacy. The idea that Jesus would somehow bless the dropping of iron fragmentation bombs up and down the Middle East to kill Muslims because they are, quote unquote, satanic. The idea that the American empire is somehow an instrument to further the will of God. And what happens is that people, when they are lured into this system, is that they're severed from rational thought. Why is that so seductive? And I think that that became kind of the central point of my book. All totalitarian movements, Hannah Arendt writes about this, Fred Stern writes about this, are driven by deep feelings of despair, anomie, the sociologist Emile Durkheim would call it, the rupturing of social bonds. And so when I would do interviews over this 2-year period with members of the Christian right, habitually they would talk about severe traumatic experiences within their own lives. These were bankruptcies, struggles with addictions, domestic, sexual abuse, all sorts of kind of personal trauma, and to the point where many of them spoke about either thinking about committing suicide or attempting to commit suicide. And of course, they became prime targets for this movement that promised that Jesus would watch over them and Jesus would promote them, and magic Jesus would intervene in their lives to protect them. And I found that approaching the movement, and I was always very upfront about my own background, which is one of the reasons why none of them ever wanted to talk about the Bible with me, since I knew it. I, at the time, could read it in Greek. But to approach them, to try to rationally argue them out of, somehow the idea that dinosaurs were created with Adam and Eve 6,000 years ago and lived together in the Creationist Museum in Peterborough, Kentucky, which I visited. There's actually a display of a T-Rex in a mock-up of the Garden of Eden with a saddle, like Adam and Eve were riding T-Rex around the Garden of Eden. I mean, or a display of a small replica supposedly of Noah's Ark, and the guide is explaining to those of us who are going through, who might have been wondering how Noah got dinosaurs on the ark. Well, Noah only put baby dinosaurs on the ark. I mean, this kind of stuff. I sat through a creationist seminar. I mean, one of the, when you get down to the details, it has a kind of bizarre absurdity. Of course, under the creation myth, light is created on the fourth day, not the first day. So you have the first 3 days in complete darkness, and the teacher is telling this seminar that we're supposed to tell. These were for teachers of creationism, that we should tell the students in the class that God created a temporary light. There's nothing in the Bible that says anything about a temporary light, but it fulfills an emotional void that, of course, is now expanding, especially with not only the grotesque social inequality, but the fallout from the pandemic, the chronic unemployment and underemployment, which in real terms is probably about 20% when you count people who have stopped looking for work, or people who are furloughed and aren't going to go back, or if you work part-time and are below the minimum wage, you're still counted as below poverty level, and not minimum wage. Below the poverty line, you're still counted as employed. If you work 1 hour a week, you're still counted as employed. So all of this is going to be exacerbated as the short-term stimulus checks, the $600 added to unemployment that ran out in July, the moratorium on foreclosures and evictions is lifted. Hunger has quadrupled during the pandemic, especially among children. So all of this, people, as Barbara Ehrenreich said, to be poor in America is one long emergency. All of this will be exacerbated. All of these are the conditions that lead people to essentially retreat into the embrace of a totalitarian system. And now we're watching, of course, the judiciary has been packed by Donald Trump, some 200 federal judges. Amy Barrett is in the process, probably, courtesy of the Republican-controlled Senate, of being confirmed. That would be 6 justices who come out of the Christian right, come out of the Federalist Society, and all of the discussion misses the point, both within her critics and her supporters. So everything revolves around her supposed, religious belief system, her faith. But what nobody is mentioning, and of course this is because the Democratic Party donors are as beholden to corporations as the Republicans, and because the mainstream media, MSNBC and everybody else, which is owned by Comcast, is a product of corporate power. What they're not talking about is how this movement is completely subservient to corporate capitalism, and that most of the ruling in places like the Supreme Court are dealing with issues of corporate control. They're not around abortion or gun control. These are, those cases may get to the Supreme Court, but it isn't predominantly what the Supreme Court focuses on. And this is Barrett's attraction. It's why corporations have now thrown millions of dollars, the Koch brothers and others, into her nomination and behind the movement, creating places like Liberty University, Patrick Henry Law School, and everything else. And so all fascist movements, and I see this as America's most authentic fascist movement since the rise of the Klan, it cloaked themselves in this kind of piety, including the early stages of the Nazi Party. Claudia Kuntz writes about this in The Nazi Conscience. And I came to the conclusion at the end of my book that unless we reintegrated these people back into the society, unless we reknit the social bonds that had been destroyed, unless we gave them a place within American society where they could engage in self-actualization, find dignity, and that comes through stable and well-compensated employment and support within that society, this movement would only grow. And that is precisely what's happened. The movement has filled the ideological void that Trump has. We've seen stalwarts of this movement, Mike Pence. This is why Noam Chomsky correctly says that if somehow Trump was removed and Pence took office, he would be more dangerous than Trump. Mike Pompeo, William Barr, Betsy DeVos. These are people who are, and Trump himself has catered to the movement, revoking the Johnson Amendment, which didn't allow religious organizations to support candidates, going after Muslims, LGBTQ rights, going after Planned Parenthood and reproductive rights. This is all of the agenda of the Christian right. And it not only isn't going away, but as things deteriorate, as that culture of despair, as Fritz Stern calls it, expands within the society, it will increasingly take power. And I will close by saying that this movement will do everything it can, whether through voter suppression or poll watchers or overturning election mandates within legislatures that it controls. It has a huge reach within the Congress and state legislatures in order to retain power. It is exceedingly dangerous, and its goal is to snuff out our open society. And since I was first made aware of this movement in 1983 by James Luther Adams, it has made a steady march towards the achievement of power. And at that point, once it actually can take control of our judicial, legislative, and executive branches of government, it will implant within the United States a very frightening form of Christian fascism. Thank you very much.
Come on. So I want to thank Chris for essentially doing what we asked, which was to give us an update about where we are in terms of this unholy alliance between white nationalism and the religious right, and sort of describe the current landscape. And then we will proceed from there. And I want to just kind of mention some assumptions that we are functioning under. And one of them is that if you are participating in this webinar, we don't have to convince you that we have a problem in this country with this unholy alliance, because we have lived through now Charlottesville. It's not letting me. There you go. Portland, Oregon, where our next speaker is from Portland, and what we have seen most recently in Michigan. As Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez put it this week, even if he is impeached or voted out in 2020, but removing Trump will not remove the infrastructure of an entire party that embraced him, the dark money that funded him, the online radicalization that drummed his army, nor the racism he amplified and reanimated. So our task is to become equipped and engaged in the work that will be required to protect our democracy in the months to come.